And speaking of Israel, I'm going to show you an edited Zoom conversation I had with John Howard, Methodist minister who is supposedly retired but currently serving in the Darlington Circuit. He's had a distinguished career, including an 11-year stint as the chair of the Wolverhampton and Shrewsbury district. And there's always been in his ministry an emphasis on justice for the poor and disadvantaged. What interested me particularly is the work he did in Israel, where he lived for a number of years. He first got to know the country by going on and later leading Holy Land pilgrimages. Then in 2013, he served as an ecumenical observer with the Human Rights Accompaniment Programme run by the World Council of Churches, which sends teams into 7 locations on the West Bank and gathers information about the realities of life for people there. The wider agenda is conflict resolution, a subject John has studied intensively, exploring ways of bringing peace to a region that has seen all too much bloodshed over the years. And just to be clear, the West Bank is regarded by the international community as illegally occupied territory following the Six-Day War of 1967, which is not how Israel itself sees it. So you've got a recipe for trouble, and there's been plenty of it, some of which John has seen at first hand. He was based in a village called Yanoun, a few kilometres from Nablus, which is the biblical Shechem. More recently, John was the British Methodist Church's representative at the World Methodist Council's Jerusalem Liaison Office, a mouthful for you, living from 2016 to 18 in Bethlehem, which, just in case you weren't quite sure, is also in the West Bank. John collected a series of letters about his experiences into this book, of which, as you can see, he's kindly sent me a copy. John's work used a strategy called protective presence, which I asked him to explain.
Protective presence is a method of violence reduction used in many different conflicts, which essentially is having people present who have the means to be able to record and report on what is taking place. And the mere fact of that presence will normally reduce the level of violence in a location.
As it, people feel they've got to behave themselves if they're going to be reported on, is that it?
I think, yes, on the whole, people committing violence don't want to be filmed. That's one aspect of it. The second aspect of it is to be able to provide a reliable and accurate picture of the situation within the West Bank, so that the 7 teams of volunteers each produce reports which go to the Jerusalem office of the World Council of Churches, who then compile those together as reports on the situation in the West Bank. They go to numerous different ambassadors, quite a wide range of different organisations use the reporting from EAPPI as their method of knowing what's happening.
That puts you under a lot of responsibility to get your reporting as accurate and impartial as we can. And we are hearing a little bit at the moment about training in unconscious bias. I'm wondering if you had such training before you went in there, because for your report to be of value, it would have to have that degree of detachment and impartiality to it.
The reports come from the 7 different placements. Yeah. And then go to the Jerusalem Liaison Office. So the reports that actually go to the embassies and so on come from the office centrally. So where there is clear bias being expressed, there is a way of moderating it through the office. Mm-hmm. Having said that, you have to say that if you place internationals in a place where there is a power disparity and violence taking place, you will always find the very fact of their presence with people who are vulnerable to violence will affect the way they report. Mm-hmm.
And because of human empathy, I suppose.
Absolutely, because yes. Within 2 days of me arriving in Yanoun, I was almost physically hauled into a ambulance, with the ambulance men saying, take a photograph of this person, look at what the injuries he's had. And he had serious burn injuries and 2 rubber bullet injuries. Now, there's a sense in which there is no way from that point that the observation can be objective in the way that a news reporter might be able to report it, because you are brought into the tragedy of the situation.
Mm-hmm.
But because those reports are going to the office, they are considerably moderated. Having said that, I mean, I subsequently spent 2 years living in the West Bank, and part of what I did was then having a role with the Work Out the Churches programme. And so I often saw the reports from individual teams of volunteers. And I would have said that a great deal of effort was made by a lot of them as individuals to avoid unconscious bias. As I say, I was based in Yanoun. Yanoun is a small village. It's almost surrounded by Israeli settlements. Just to explain, there is a distinction between what are called settlements and outposts. The Itamar settlement is one of the larger settlements near to Nablus, and it has something like 12 different outposts. Now, outposts are sometimes individual farms, sometimes small villages that relate to the settlement, but very often are not only illegal under international law, they're illegal under Israeli law as well, many of the settlements. And that's true of the outposts around Yanoun.
Well, I'm right. The whole of the West Bank is illegally occupied under international law. Is that right?
That's correct. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it is. And one of the things that, of course, is illegal under international law is for an occupying country to impose its own population upon those who are the occupied territory.
Yeah.
So what we would do each morning, and indeed each evening, is the team of us would go for a walk around the village in order to make visible the fact we were present. So normally speaking, about 7 o'clock in the morning, we would leave the building which was our base and walk for about 3/4 of an hour around the village and around the area where they farm for the village, simply in order to be seen by the settlers who were living in the outposts and the settlement. Sometimes that led to confrontations. Sometimes it simply led to experiences that you just remember. I mean, such as, because it was a agricultural community, we got to know the shepherds, and to see the shepherds leading their sheep in just the way in which the Bible describes the sheep knowing their shepherd. I mean, it's just wonderful to see.
Yeah.
And we would daily see 2 shepherds with their flocks going up, talking to each other, the sheep mingling, one shepherd going off, and the sheep just following the shepherd. But also tragic moments. I mean, one particular evening, we were invited to have some tea, hospitality, by a Palestinian family, a young mother with young children. Her husband was a farmer. The following day, I was the only team member left in the village. On this particular occasion, I was the one left in Yanoun, and I got a mobile phone call to say that a group of armed settlers were entering the village. So I immediately went down to the other side of the village where the settlers were coming in. As I went down, the woman who'd given us tea the evening beforehand was cuddling her children, hiding in an olive grove, shaking with fear. And the picture of her in abject terror, because there were a group of armed settlers coming into the village, was a picture I will never lose from my mind.
And presumably that terror was based on some memories of violence having been done gratuitously?
Yes. In the Yanoun village, The reason we had a presence there 365 days of the year was because at one stage the village had to be evacuated because there was so much violence against the villagers. All sorts of different things happen, from beatings, poisoning of animals, dropping of various chemicals into the only well, which was the water supply for the village. All of these things were part of the experience that had been the reason why the team was based at Yanu.
Now we fast forward to 2016, where John is working in Bethlehem as a mission partner with the Methodist Liaison Office.
I lived in a community which was predominantly Palestinian Christians, a village called Bet Jala, which is a part of the Bethlehem area. So I could easily walk to Manger Square from where I lived.
I was going to say, if you hear Bethlehem, you think, well, that's on the tourist route, that's on the pilgrimage route, that's on the Holy Land Tour thing. So that presumably gives Bethlehem a different feel from some of the other places round about, which aren't on that map.
To an extent, but also Bethlehem has the wall, the separation barrier. The community of Bethlehem has lost a large proportion of the land that it used to relate to. Bethlehem, although we think of it as being a tourist resort, used to be predominantly an agricultural community, but it has lost a huge proportion of the land that it related to when the separation barrier was built. It's very difficult for people who live in Bethlehem to cross the barrier and then farm the other side of the barrier.
Yeah. And the justification for the wall would be that it protects Israelis against terrorism. Do you want to say anything about terrorism as you've experienced it or perceive it?
That's certainly the reason that was given for the wall. In my time in Bethlehem, and indeed when I was a human rights observer, my experience has been that the huge majority of Palestinians want to live in peace with Israelis. I have met with people who would be called terrorists, people who will express the view that violence is justified. I always argue against the use of violence. But we ought to remember that international law does make provision for occupied people to resist the occupation. Now, I always argue with Palestinians that that is actually unhelpful to their situation.
Resistance doesn't have to be violent, does it? It can be very creative and non-violent.
Yes, but we have to remember, the famous saying that one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. But I would want to emphasise that the huge majority, and I'm talking about more than 95% of the people I've met, will argue that the only sensible strategy for Palestinians is peaceful forms of resistance, though it's very difficult even to identify what those can be, because of course all Palestinians are under martial law within the West Bank, not in Israel, but within the West Bank under martial law, and therefore can be detained without trial. According to B'Tselem, which is a Jewish human rights organization, the largest proportion of people detained under those provisions are people who actually have been non-violent protesters, not violent protesters.
Almost as if the Israelis want to provoke violence to give themselves an excuse to clap down even more savagely.
I didn't say that, but I might have some sympathy with what you were saying. Yeah. Yes, I can give an account, for example, of what happened on one Palm Sunday. One of my colleagues there lives very close to Manger Square, and on the Saturday night before Palm Sunday, had woken up in the middle of the night, 2:00 in the morning, so I suppose, strictly speaking, that was Palm Sunday, to hear huge crashing and banging. When she opened her front door to look down the stairs of her apartment, it was 20 Israeli soldiers who had broken into the apartment downstairs and were holding a machine gun at the head of an 80-year-old Palestinian woman. When we looked into the reason for this raid, and we spoke to somebody who had been an Israeli soldier and had been in Bethlehem, we described it, and he said that he had been on raids just like that, which were training exercises for the Israeli soldiers.
The woman had just been picked on at random.
It was not at random in the sense that they knew it was a Palestinian family. They wouldn't do that to an international. But it
there was no particular reason to suspect this family of anything.
No reason whatsoever to suspect that there was anybody who had committed any violence or any crime in that house. Right. But it was a training exercise for the Israeli soldiers.